Have you ever wondered why fantasy maps feel so incredibly real to readers? Imagine opening a book and immediately believing in another entire world completely. That emotional pull often starts with a single illustrated fantasy map design. Fantasy maps are not decorations. They are gateways into storytelling immersion itself. They shape how readers perceive distance, danger, and emotional journey within narrative world. Without maps, many fictional worlds would feel confusing and disconnected to readers. Authors use maps to anchor imagination in structured geography consistently across narrative. This visual structure helps readers track journeys and character movement easily overall. But something deeper is happening whenever readers study these maps closely, though. Fantasy maps subtly influence emotional expectations before story begins, even reading starts. Readers often feel suspense just by observing distant, unknown regions on map. These maps create anticipation before any character even appears in story context. Think about how a blank space invites endless imagination possibilities for readers. That blankness often becomes the most powerful storytelling tool in fantasy fiction. Map boundaries can even hint at political conflict or danger within world. This is where fantasy maps shift from art to narrative device itself entirely. They are not just visuals. They actively guide reader interpretation process itself. Consider Tolkien's Middle-earth map as a foundation for epic storytelling creation process. Every mountain and river shapes how the story unfolds naturally over time. Readers navigate emotional landscapes through these carefully drawn geographies in stories they read. A well-designed map makes fictional travel feel believable and real to readers. It gives direction even when characters feel lost emotionally within narrative flow. Fantasy maps also establish scale, showing vastness of imagined worlds clearly overall. That scale helps readers feel small within epic narratives, completely immersive worlds. Without maps, readers must rely only on textual descriptions throughout story experience. That can limit imagination compared to visual geographic guidance provided in maps. Maps also improve continuity across complex storylines and sequels significantly overall narrative. They prevent inconsistencies in travel time and world logic within fiction universes. Readers often revisit maps to understand story progression better over time clearly. This interaction deepens engagement far beyond simple reading experience itself overall narrative. Interestingly, fantasy maps can sometimes mislead readers intentionally for dramatic storytelling effect. This creates mystery that drives curiosity throughout the narrative experience journey story. Some maps hide secrets that only later become meaningful to readers fully. This technique turns maps into storytelling, foreshadowing tools that enhance narrative depth significantly. Readers may not realize maps are shaping their expectations subconsciously during reading process. That subconscious influence is what makes fantasy maps powerful in storytelling media. Think of maps as silent narrators guiding every journey within stories' worlds. They speak without words, yet influence emotional perception deeply for readers universally. This visual language complements written storytelling in unique ways across fantasy fiction. It bridges imagination gaps between author and reader experience seamlessly in storytelling journeys. Every new fantasy map invites readers to explore unknown stories immediately within. That invitation is often stronger than opening chapters themselves in novels today. Maps set tone before any character dialogue begins unfolding in story world. They act as prelude to entire narrative journeys ahead for readers' experience. Even simple map lines can trigger vivid imagination bursts instantly in minds readers. This is why fantasy maps remain essential in storytelling today, across genres literature. They transform abstract worlds into tangible geographic experiences for engaged readers everywhere. Readers feel more emotionally connected through mapped landscapes in stories they experience. This connection enhances overall storytelling impact dramatically for readers across fantasy worlds. Fantasy maps are therefore more than artistic illustrations in books and stories worldwide. They are foundational storytelling elements, shaping reader imagination deeply in fantasy literature today. Without them, many fantasy worlds would lose coherence for readers significantly overall. They provide invisible structure supporting entire narrative ecosystems in fiction world-building stories. Readers subconsciously rely on maps to build mental models of worlds. Now we step deeper into how fantasy maps actively shape storytelling perception itself. Most readers never realize maps can control emotional pacing within a narrative. A map is often the first storytelling clue an author secretly gives. It silently establishes where danger, safety, and mystery will exist later. This spatial setup influences how readers emotionally interpret every upcoming journey. When readers see distant mountains, they already expect hardship ahead naturally. Rivers and borders often hint at political tension without any written explanation. This means maps can tell a story even before chapters begin unfolding. Authors carefully design geography to guide emotional rhythm throughout entire narratives. A long distance between cities can signal struggle, time, and transformation. Meanwhile, clustered regions often suggest conflict, chaos, or cultural intensity within story. These subtle design choices influence reader expectations more than dialogue sometimes does. Fantasy maps also control how fast readers mentally travel through story events. Short distances feel like quick adventures, while long ones feel epic journeys. This perception shapes how grand or intimate a story feels overall. Even scale bars and proportions affect emotional storytelling impact on readers deeply. A slightly exaggerated continent can make a world feel more legendary. Conversely, compact maps can create tension by making everything feel close. This proximity increases emotional urgency during character decisions and conflict significantly. Readers subconsciously absorb these spatial cues without questioning their influence at all. That silent influence is what makes fantasy maps so powerful storytelling tools. In many stories, maps are designed before characters or plots even exist. This allows geography to dictate how stories will naturally unfold later. Writers often discover their own narratives by exploring mapped landscapes first. That process turns world building into a discovery rather than pure invention. Some fantasy authors even describe maps as the true story backbone. Without geography, character journeys would lack direction and emotional grounding entirely. Maps also allow writers to balance realism with imaginative freedom carefully. They define rules that make fictional worlds feel consistent and believable. Readers trust stories more when geography feels structured and logically sound. That trust strengthens immersion and keeps audiences invested in long narratives. Even fantasy creatures and kingdoms gain credibility through mapped placement in worlds. A dragon's mountain feels more real when shown on a map. Similarly, hidden kingdoms feel more mysterious when tucked into remote regions. This spatial storytelling builds curiosity that words alone cannot easily create. Maps also help readers remember complex storylines more effectively over time. Visual geography acts as a memory anchor throughout long fantasy series. That is why readers often revisit maps between different book chapters. They are not just reference tools, but emotional storytelling companions for readers. Interestingly, map errors or ambiguities can sometimes enhance storytelling mystery further. Confusing regions invite theories, speculation, and deeper reader engagement with story. This uncertainty keeps audiences actively thinking beyond written pages of novels. In this way, maps become interactive storytelling elements rather than static images. They encourage exploration even when no physical journey is actually happening. Readers mentally travel through unknown regions while imagining possible story outcomes. This imagination-driven movement is central to fantasy storytelling effectiveness overall. Every map choice subtly directs emotional attention towards specific narrative themes. Even empty spaces can suggest untold stories waiting to be discovered. That sense of unknown is what keeps fantasy worlds endlessly fascinating. Maps essentially turn silence into storytelling opportunity for both writers and readers. They provide structure while still leaving room for imagination to grow. This balance is what makes fantasy storytelling feel so deeply immersive. Without maps, many stories would lose their sense of epic scale. Geography gives weight to decisions, journeys, and conflicts within fictional worlds. It transforms abstract ideas into lived experiences inside reader imagination. That transformation is the true magic behind fantasy map storytelling design. But the most surprising influence of maps is still ahead to explore. Because maps do not just support stories, they quietly rewrite them. Next, we uncover how maps can even change narrative meaning entirely. And the most surprising truth is that fantasy maps can rewrite stories entirely. Many readers assume maps simply illustrate a story already fully decided. In reality, maps often reshape how stories are interpreted and understood. A single geographic shift can completely change emotional meaning of events. For example, distance can turn a simple journey into a heroic saga. Meanwhile, close proximity can transform epic conflict into personal tragedy. This means geography directly influences emotional weight of storytelling decisions. Authors sometimes adjust maps after writing to better fit narrative tone. Other times, they change stories entirely to match map logic. This constant interaction creates a feedback loop between story and geography. That loop is where fantasy storytelling becomes truly dynamic and living. Readers rarely see this hidden creative negotiation behind finished fantasy worlds. They only experience the polished harmony between map and narrative flow. But behind that harmony lies continuous shaping and reshaping of meaning. Even small map details can alter reader perception of character journeys. A mountain pass may suggest danger even if story never confirms it. An isolated island can imply mystery without a single written clue. These visual suggestions influence imagination more strongly than explicit descriptions. That is why fantasy maps feel emotionally powerful even in silence. They communicate atmosphere without needing dialogue or narrative explanation at all. In many cases, readers remember maps longer than specific story scenes. This is because spatial memory connects deeply with emotional experience. When readers recall journeys, they often visualize paths on the map. The visualization becomes part of their personal interpretation of story. This means every reader carries a slightly different version of same world. Fantasy maps therefore create personalized storytelling experiences for each individual reader. No two imaginations navigate the map in exactly the same way. This uniqueness is what makes fantasy worlds feel endlessly alive. Maps also influence fan theories and extended world building outside original stories. Readers often expand unseen regions mentally based on empty map spaces. These imagined expansions become part of fandom creativity and discussion culture. In this way, Maps continue storytelling beyond the original text itself. They keep worlds active in reader imagination long after books end. This extended engagement is rare in most other forms of storytelling. Fantasy maps essentially transform passive reading into active world exploration. That exploration builds emotional ownership of fictional worlds among readers. Once a reader understands a map, they feel part of that world. This emotional connection is what makes fantasy storytelling so powerful. It turns fiction into something experienced rather than simply observed. And that experience begins with understanding the silent language of maps. So fantasy maps are not background art, but narrative engines themselves. They shape pacing, emotion, meaning, and even story interpretation deeply. They guide imagination while still allowing freedom for personal discovery. This balance between control and freedom defines great fantasy storytelling. Without maps, many stories would lose their sense of direction and scale. With maps, even the simplest journey becomes emotionally significant and meaningful. That is the hidden power most readers never consciously recognize, yet it quietly shapes every fantasy world we explore today. So next time you see a fantasy map, look closer. You are not just seeing geography, but the story itself being formed. Maps quietly decide how epic, dangerous, or intimate a story feels. They influence emotions before a single chapter is even read. Every line drawn becomes part of the narrative experience itself. Even empty spaces hold meaning waiting to be discovered later. Fantasy worlds begin not with words, but with imagined geography first. Readers become explorers through visual landscapes drawn by the author. That exploration is what keeps fantasy stories alive for generations. Maps turn imagination into structured emotional journeys across fictional worlds. They are the hidden foundation of every great fantasy story ever told. And once you understand this, fantasy storytelling will never feel the same again.